I don't remember agreeing to any of this, Ethan Cole said, staring at the line of security drones as they recalibrated their sensors for the third time in under a minute, which was 2 more times than protocol required and exactly 3 more times than made him comfortable. The orbital station above Kareth Prime had been designed to impress visiting dignitaries, all polished alloy corridors and gravity that hummed just slightly off-key, like it had opinions about who deserved to stand on it. And Ethan, Maintenance Tier 3, definitely wasn't on that list. He adjusted the sleeve of his worn utility jacket and glanced at the diagnostic panel hovering beside him, pretending to be deeply invested in a minor coolant imbalance that absolutely could have waited another 6 hours. But pretending was a skill he'd gotten good at, especially in places where people with real authority walked past without noticing him, which had been the plan. Keep your head down, fix what breaks, don't get involved in anything that requires clearance you don't have. Simple, efficient, survivable. At least that's what he told himself right up until the station's ambient lighting shifted, just a fraction dimmer, just enough that conversations softened and footsteps slowed, the kind of change you didn't notice unless you spent most of your time watching things you weren't supposed to. Ethan looked up despite himself, because the corridor ahead had gone from busy to careful, and careful meant important, and important meant trouble. A group of officers moved past first, uniforms crisp, voices low, followed by advisors who looked like they had never once been ignored in their lives. And then she walked in, Commander Lyra Vane, though Ethan didn't know her name yet. Only that the air seemed to rearrange itself around her like it had been waiting for instructions. She looked almost human at first glance, tall, composed, dark hair drawn back in a precise line, but the long, elegant curve of her ears marked her as something else entirely, something older, something that didn't need to prove it belonged anywhere. Her gaze moved across the corridor with quiet efficiency, cataloging, dismissing, evaluating. And for a moment Ethan was certain it would pass over him the way everyone else's did, like he was part of the background system, functional but irrelevant, which would have been ideal, except it didn't. It stopped, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that his instincts, the ones that had kept him out of trouble more times than he could count, immediately started filing complaints. Her eyes lingered on him just a second too long, and something in her posture shifted, subtle, controlled, but real, like she'd found something she hadn't expected to find. Ethan straightened slightly before he could stop himself, because being looked at like that usually meant you'd done something wrong, or worse, something noticeable. He gave a small, polite nod, the kind that said I exist, but I'm not a problem, and waited for her to move on. She didn't, not right away, and somewhere behind him, a maintenance drone clipped a wall with a soft metallic thud as if even it had misjudged the moment. Ethan cleared his throat quietly and glanced back at his panel, giving the illusion of productivity while very much aware that the most powerful person in the corridor had just decided he was worth a second look, which was unfortunate, because Ethan had built his entire career on not being worth even a first one. And as the station's central system flickered for a fraction of a second, recalibrating access permissions that had no reason to change, he had the distinct, unwelcome feeling that something had already started, and no one had bothered to inform him why. The system corrected itself too quickly, which was always the first sign something was wrong, and Ethan noticed because fixing things for a living meant noticing when they tried to hide. The diagnostic panel in front of him flickered once, and then settled into a clean green status that it absolutely had not earned. He narrowed his eyes slightly, tilting his head as if the angle might convince the numbers to admit the truth. But the numbers stayed polite. They always did when something above his clearance level had already decided what reality should look like. He tapped the interface. Again, slower this time, feeling the faint resistance in the projection field, like it was thinking about refusing him. Do not start acting intelligent now, he muttered under his breath, because machines that started thinking were usually owned by someone important, and someone important meant someone he did not want to meet. Behind him, footsteps resumed, quieter than before, more deliberate, and he could feel it without turning that the corridor had reorganized itself around her presence. Commander Lyra Vane moved past him at a measured pace, not hurried, not slow, just precise enough to suggest she had already accounted for everything that would happen in the next 10 minutes, including him, which was a deeply uncomfortable thought. Ethan kept his focus on the panel, but his attention drifted sideways anyway, cataloging details the way he always did when something did not make sense. Her posture was too relaxed for someone with that level of authority, her gaze too controlled. To be casual, and there was something else, something in the way her ears angled slightly forward, not aggressive, not defensive, but attentive, like she was listening for something only she expected to hear. He had seen that look before, not often, but enough to recognize it. It was the look people had when they thought they had found a pattern where there should not be one, and for reasons he could not fully explain, that made him feel like the pattern. You are recalibrating a system that does not require recalibration, a voice said from his right, smooth, precise, and entirely uninterested in pretending this was a casual conversation. Ethan exhaled slowly before turning, because reacting too quickly would have been a confession. Preventative maintenance, he replied, which was technically true in the same way calling a storm a weather adjustment was technically accurate. Lyra regarded him for a moment, her expression neutral but not empty. There was calculation there, layered and quiet. Preventative maintenance, she repeated, as if testing the phrase for structural integrity. On a closed-loop coolant system with no recorded variance in the last 48 hours, Ethan offered a small shrug. The universal gesture for I am aware this sounds questionable, and I am choosing to stand by it anyway. I like to stay ahead of problems, he said. Problems tend to disagree with that philosophy. Something shifted then, not in her words, but in the space between them, a fraction of a second where the corridor seemed to hold its breath again. Her gaze moved past him briefly to the panel, and the system responded before he could, data layers expanding, access permissions, unlocking in a cascade that made his stomach drop a solid 2 inches, because that was not his access level, that was not even close to his access level, and yet the system had just decided he belonged there. Lyra's ears tilted, just slightly, and for the first time there was something almost resembling recognition in her eyes, not surprise, not curiosity, but something quieter, more certain, like she had just confirmed a theory she had been carrying for a long time. Ethan followed her gaze back to the panel, watching as restricted protocols unfolded in front of him like they had been waiting for permission he did not remember giving. That seems excessive, he said carefully, because understatement had kept him alive this long. She did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice had softened by a degree so small it would have been easy to miss if he had not been listening for exactly that. Yes, she said, it does. And then she looked back at him, not past him this time, not through him, but directly at him, and the station's system, helpful as always, quietly reassigned his clearance status again, as if reality itself had decided to take her side without asking him first. The system did not usually hesitate, which was why the half-second delay before responding to Ethan's next input felt louder than an alarm. He kept his hand steady over the interface, pretending this was still routine, pretending that the sudden expansion of restricted data layers had not just rewritten the rules of his day. Behind him, the corridor had not returned to normal. It had settled into something more careful, like a room where people were pretending not to listen while very much listening. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes tracking the scrolling diagnostics that now included subsystems he had only ever read about in training manuals he was not supposed to open. This is not my department, he said quietly, mostly to himself, because saying it out loud made it feel like it might still be true. Not anymore, Lyra replied, her voice calm in a way that suggested the decision had already been made somewhere far above both of them. Ethan glanced sideways at her, measuring tone, posture, the subtle angle of her ears which had shifted again, forward now, attentive in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like confirmation. And that was worse. Curiosity could be dismissed. Confirmation meant he had already failed to stay invisible. With respect, he said carefully, because respect was a useful shield. I do not recall applying for a promotion. One corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement that he had said something structurally. Interesting, this is not a promotion, she said, and for a moment Ethan considered the possibility that it might be something significantly less optional. The panel flickered again, not an error this time but a request, a system-level prompt that unfolded across the interface with the quiet confidence of something that expected to be obeyed. Authorization required for core access realignment. Ethan stared at it, then at his own identifier reflected in the lower corner of the display, which now carried a designation he had never seen attached to his name before, something that did not belong to maintenance personnel or even mid-tier officers, something that belonged to a category he did not have a word for yet. That seems incorrect, he said, because understatement remained his preferred coping mechanism. It is not incorrect, Lyra answered, and there was no hesitation in it, no room for interpretation, just a statement placed carefully into reality, as if she had done this before. Ethan let out a breath that might have been a laugh on a better day. That is concerning, he said. You will find that concern is not always useful, she replied, her gaze never leaving the interface. The system chimed softly, impatient in a way that felt almost personal, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive at this exact moment. Ethan hesitated, which was new. He did not usually hesitate with systems. Machines followed rules, even when those rules were complicated. But this felt like stepping into a conversation that had started without him. If I press this, he said, not looking at her, something changes. Yes, she said. It already has. That was not reassuring, but it was honest. And honesty, Ethan had learned, was often the most dangerous part of any situation. He rested his finger against the interface, feeling the faint resistance of the projection field, the system recognizing him now, not as a technician, not as background, but as something it was designed to respond to, which raised a question he was not sure he wanted answered. What exactly had it been waiting for? He glanced at Lyra again, searching for hesitation, doubt, anything that suggested this could still be reversed. But she stood perfectly still, composed, certain, like someone who had finally reached the part of the plan that mattered. And that was when Ethan realized this was not about a system error or a misassigned clearance, or even a mistake. This was deliberate, precise, and for reasons he did not yet understand, it involved him. All right, he said quietly, because at some point pretending not to be involved became more suspicious than just being involved. Let us see what I am apparently qualified to do. And he pressed the authorization. The station did not just respond. It shifted, not physically, not in any way that could be measured by standard instruments, but in the subtle, unsettling way environments do when they decide to acknowledge someone's presence. Lights recalibrated, data streams rerouted, and somewhere deep in the system architecture, something long dormant recognized his input and answered back, not with an error, not with a warning, but with acceptance, immediate and absolute. As if he had never been unauthorized at all, Ethan stared at the screen as new protocols unfolded, ancient, complex, and entirely outside the scope of anything he should have been able to access. And for the first time since this had started, he did not feel confused. He felt identified, which was worse, because confusion could be fixed, but recognition meant this had been waiting, and Lyra, standing beside him with that same quiet certainty, had just confirmed that it had been waiting for him. The station did not return to normal after that, which was how Ethan knew it was not going to. The lighting remained just slightly too attentive, the systems just slightly too responsive, like a room that had decided he mattered and was not sure how to behave about it yet. The panel in front of him continued unfolding layers of data that should have required multiple authorization chains, yet it responded to him alone. No delay, no verification, just immediate compliance. And that was the part that bothered him most. Systems did not trust without reason. I am going to assume this is temporary, he said, mostly because saying anything else would have sounded like acceptance. Lyra did not answer right away, her gaze moving across the data streams with the kind of familiarity that suggested none of this surprised her, which meant she had expected it, which meant this was not a discovery, it was a confirmation. Temporary is a matter of perspective, she said finally, her tone even, controlled, but carrying something beneath it now, something that had shifted from observation to decision. Ethan leaned back slightly, giving himself a few inches of distance from the panel, as if that might restore a sense of proportion to the situation. It did not. The data remained steady and undeniable. That is not reassuring, he replied. It is not intended to be, she said, and there it was again. That quiet honesty that made everything worse, because it left no room for him to pretend. This was a misunderstanding. A soft chime echoed through the corridor then, not loud, but precise, the kind of sound that carried authority without needing volume. Ethan recognized it a fraction of a second before the environment reacted. Officers straightened, conversation stopped, and the air shifted again, not toward Lyra this time, but toward something larger, something institutional. That is not for me, is it? He said, already suspecting the answer. Lyra's ears angled slightly, listening to the tone of the signal rather than the volume. It is for us, she said, and that single word rearranged the situation more effectively than anything else had so far. Us implied inclusion, involvement, responsibility, all things Ethan had been actively avoiding for most of his career. I prefer assignments that involve less collective pronouns, he muttered, but he was already stepping away from the panel, because ignoring a call like that was not a viable survival strategy. The corridor ahead began to clear with quiet efficiency, personnel moving aside without being told, creating a path that Ethan was very certain was not meant for him. And yet there it was, open and waiting. Lyra moved first, not looking back to check if he would follow, which was either confidence or inevitability. And Ethan found himself doing exactly that, falling into step beside someone who operated on a level he did not fully understand. The station seemed to notice their movement, access points unlocking ahead of them in a sequence that felt less like navigation and more like permission. Doors that would have required clearance he did not possess slid open without hesitation. Systems that should have flagged his presence instead adjusted to accommodate it. And with each step, the illusion that he was still an outsider thinned, replaced by something far more uncomfortable, the sense that he had always been part of this, whether he knew it or not. You are not going to explain any of this, are you? He said quietly as they approached a set of doors larger than the rest, reinforced, ceremonial in a way that suggested decisions made beyond them had consequences that lasted longer than individual careers. Lyra paused for just a fraction of a second, enough to acknowledge the question, not enough to answer it directly. Explanations are inefficient. Before confirmation, she said, and then the doors opened, revealing a chamber filled with people who had never once expected to see Ethan Cole walk in at her side. The room went still, not gradually, not politely, but completely, as if the concept of movement had been reconsidered, and Ethan, who had spent years perfecting the art of being unnoticed, suddenly found himself at the exact center of attention, which would have been manageable if not for the fact that Lyra did not hesitate, did not slow, did not give the room time to process. She stepped forward into the silence, raised her hand with effortless authority, and pointed directly at him. And Ethan had just enough time to think that this was about to become significantly more complicated before she spoke. The silence did not break when she spoke. It deepened, as if the room had decided that reacting would be premature until it understood what it had just heard. Lyra's hand remained steady, her fingers still directed at Ethan with a precision that did not allow for misinterpretation. He is mine, she said, her voice calm, unhurried, and far more dangerous for it, because there was no emphasis, no drama, just a statement placed into the center of the chamber like a fact that had always existed and had simply been waiting to be acknowledged. Ethan did not move at first, which was impressive considering every instinct he had was currently recommending distance, denial, or possibly a polite exit through the nearest wall. Instead, he glanced behind him again, just to confirm that reality had not misplaced another human who might better fit that description. It had not. The space behind him remained empty, which meant the situation was, unfortunately, accurate. I feel like there is context missing, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to prove he was still capable of participating in his own life. No one laughed, which he took as confirmation that humor was not going to solve this one. Across the chamber, a senior officer shifted, the movement small but significant, like a system attempting to reboot after encountering an unexpected variable. Commander, the officer began carefully. This designation was not included in the briefing. Lyra did not look at him, which somehow carried more authority than if she had. Then the briefing was incomplete, she replied, and that was the end of that, not because the officer agreed, but because the structure of the room had just been reminded who defined accuracy. Ethan let out a slow breath, adjusting his grip on the invisible concept of control that had just been removed from his immediate reach. With respect, he said, choosing his words with the kind of care usually reserved for unstable machinery. I do not recall being consulted. Lyra turned her head slightly then, her gaze settling on him with that same measured intensity, and for a moment the room ceased to exist in any meaningful way. You were not required to be, she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, because there was no conflict in her tone, no challenge, just certainty. Like she was explaining a natural law he had somehow missed. Ethan nodded once, slow, thoughtful, because reacting quickly would have implied understanding, and he was not prepared to offer that yet. That feels like an oversight, he replied. It is not, she said, and again there was no hesitation. The chamber responded to her words the way it had to everything else she had done so far, with silence and attention. Advisors exchanged glances. Data slates remained suspended midair, as if gravity had been given permission to pause, and Ethan became acutely aware that every eye in the room had shifted from her to him, measuring, recalculating, attempting to reconcile the gap between what they saw and what they had just been told. He straightened slightly under the scrutiny, not out of confidence, but because posture was one of the few things still under his control. For clarity, he said, because clarity was a reasonable request, even in unreasonable situations. This is a temporary arrangement. Lyra's ears angled just slightly, and there it was again, that almost imperceptible softening. The smallest shift in expression that suggested the question had been anticipated long before it was asked. No, she said, and the words settled into the room with the weight of something permanent. Ethan considered that, not the word itself, but the certainty behind it, and found that arguing would require a level of information he did not currently possess, which placed him at a disadvantage he did not enjoy. Understood, he said finally, which was not agreement, but it was the closest available option. A murmur moved through the chamber then, subtle, controlled, but present, like a system slowly adjusting to a new parameter it had not been designed to process. Lyra lowered her hand, the gesture small but definitive, and with it the declaration moved from action to fact, something that could no longer be undone simply by ignoring it. She stepped forward another pace, closing the distance between them in a way that was neither intimate nor distant, just deliberate. And for the first time since this had started, she spoke in a voice meant only for him, quiet enough that the room could not hear, but clear enough that he could not mistake it. You are exactly where you are supposed to be, she said, and Ethan, who had spent most of his life ensuring he was exactly where no one needed him to be, felt something shift in a way that had nothing to do with systems, or authority, or protocol, because this was not a mistake, and whatever came next was not going to ask for his permission. The room did not recover, it recalibrated, and that was worse, because recovery implied a return to normal, while recalibration meant this was the new normal, and everyone in the chamber was now adjusting to it whether they agreed or not. Ethan could feel the shift in the way people looked at him, not openly, not rudely, but with the kind of controlled attention reserved for anomalies that might become problems if left unexamined. He had seen that look before directed at faulty systems and unpredictable variables, and he did not enjoy being either. He exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional rather than accidental. So, he said, because someone had to introduce a structure to the situation before it collapsed under its own ambiguity. What exactly changes now? It was a reasonable question, which meant it was unlikely to receive a simple answer. Lyra did not respond immediately, her gaze sweeping across the chamber, taking in reactions, noting who adjusted their posture, who avoided eye contact, who leaned just slightly forward as if proximity might reveal something the rest of them were missing. She cataloged it all with quiet efficiency before returning her attention to him. Nothing, she said, and then, after a fraction of a second that carried more meaning than the word itself, everything. Ethan nodded once, because that was about as helpful as he had expected. I appreciate the precision, he replied, dry enough to be safe. A faint ripple moved through the room, not quite laughter, but close enough to prove that. Tension had edges. Lyra's expression did not change, but her ears shifted again, just slightly inward, which he was beginning to suspect meant something like restrained approval, or perhaps just an acknowledgement that he was handling the situation better than anticipated. Neither option was particularly comforting. Your presence alters the operational parameters of this station, she continued, addressing the room now as much as him, her voice steady, controlled, leaving no room for interruption. Effective immediately, access hierarchies will be adjusted to reflect that landed, not loudly, but definitively, like a piece of machinery locking into place. Across the chamber, a senior advisor finally allowed himself a step forward, careful, measured. Commander, with respect, reassigning authority structures based on an unverified designation presents. It has been verified, Lyra said, cutting through the sentence without raising her voice, and the advisor stopped. Not because he agreed, but because the structure of the conversation had just been closed to him. Ethan watched that exchange with a growing awareness that this was no longer about a single statement. This was systemic, deliberate, and far larger than anything he had intended to be part of. I would like to point out, he said, because ignoring the scale of the situation felt irresponsible, that I have not actually done anything yet. A few heads turned at that, subtle, interested. Lyra looked at him again, and there it was, that same quiet certainty, unchanged, unaffected by logic or expectation. You already have, she said, and for a moment Ethan considered asking for clarification, but something in her tone suggested that whatever he had done, it had not happened recently, and that was a line of inquiry he was not prepared to follow in front of an audience. The station chimed again, softer this time, almost acknowledging the shift in command, and new data began populating across the central displays in the chamber, strategic overlays, system diagnostics, predictive models that extended far beyond routine operations, and without any conscious decision on his part, Ethan found himself reading them, not struggling, not approximating, but understanding, patterns aligning in his mind with an ease that should not have been possible. That is new, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Lyra's gaze did not leave him. No, she said, it is not. And that was when the room truly went still again, because understanding something you were never trained to understand was not a skill, it was a revelation. And Ethan, standing at the center of a system that had just rewritten itself around him, realized that whatever role he had been given, it was not new, it was remembered, and that was a problem, because he did not remember it at all. The room did not question the data, it questioned him, and Ethan could feel it in the subtle shifts of posture, in the way conversations did not start, but also did not fully stop, like a system waiting for permission to doubt out loud. The central displays continued feeding information into the space, layered, complex, and entirely beyond what a maintenance technician should be able to process without visible strain. And yet he followed it, line by line, pattern by pattern, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because ignoring it felt more unnatural than understanding it. There is a routing inefficiency in Sector 12, he said before he could stop himself, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest cluster of officers. If the load spikes above 40%, the system compensates too late and creates a feedback delay. Silence answered him, not the earlier kind, but a sharper version. Focused, evaluative, a senior engineer stepped forward, frowning slightly as he pulled up the same data on his own interface, fingers moving faster now, searching for the discrepancy Ethan had just described. That is not in the current report, the engineer said, not dismissive, but cautious, like someone approaching a claim that should not exist. Ethan tilted his head slightly. I still on the display. It is not a current issue, he said. It is a future one. Approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes from now if traffic continues at the present rate. The engineer's hand slowed, then stopped. Entirely, because predictions like that required access to models that were not available at this level, or at least they had not been until a few minutes ago. Lyra did not react outwardly, but her attention sharpened, her ears angled forward with a precision that suggested she was listening not just to his words, but to the pattern behind them. Run the simulation, she said, and it was not a suggestion. The engineer hesitated for half a second, then complied, because hesitation was allowed. Refusal was not. The system processed the request, layers of predictive modeling unfolding across the display, variables adjusting, timelines compressing, and then it resolved, clean, undeniable, exactly as Ethan had described. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but present, like a structure acknowledging a stress point it had previously ignored. Ethan exhaled quietly, more annoyed than impressed. That seems inefficient, he said, because understatement was still doing most of the heavy lifting in his emotional management. It was not identified in previous analyses, the engineer admitted, his tone shifting now from skepticism to something closer to respect, or at least caution. Lyra stepped forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Ethan. It has been identified now, she said, and with that, the conversation closed again, not because it was resolved, but because it had reached a conclusion she was satisfied with. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the display, then back at her again. Because this was becoming a pattern he could not ignore, she was not surprised by any of this, not by his access, not by his understanding, not even by the fact that he was identifying problems before they existed, which suggested that this was not new information to her. It was confirmation. You expected this, he said quietly, not accusing, just stating what had become increasingly obvious. Lyra did not deny it, which was answer enough. I expected you, she replied, and that was somehow more precise, more deliberate. Ethan considered that, the wording, the structure, the implication that he was not an outcome, but an input, something the system had been waiting to process. That is not a sentence people usually say to me, he said, dry enough to maintain distance. A faint shift touched her expression again, that almost smile that never quite arrived. That is because most people do not know what to look for, she said, and the room, still adjusting to a reality that had just expanded beyond its original parameters, went quiet again, not from shock this time, but from understanding. Because whatever Ethan Cole was, he was no longer a background variable, and whatever Lyra Vane had just done, it was not a mistake, it was a selection, and the system, from the smallest maintenance panel to the largest strategic model, had just agreed with her. The room did not relax after the confirmation. It tightened, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way a system does when it realizes the rules it was built on are no longer sufficient. Ethan could feel it in the silence that followed his last observation. Not disbelief anymore, but recalculation. People were no longer asking if he was wrong. They were asking what else he might see. And that was a much more dangerous position to occupy. He shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself in something simple, physical, because the data on the displays had started to feel less like information and more like memory. And that was not a comfortable distinction. All right, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. What else is about to break? The words were half humor, half strategy, because if this was going to continue, he preferred to stay ahead of it. The system answered before anyone else could. A subtle fluctuation rippling across the central display, small enough to be dismissed, except now no one in the room was dismissing anything he might notice. Ethan's gaze sharpened, tracking the anomaly as it moved through the network, not randomly, not chaotically, but with a pattern that felt intentional, like a question waiting to be answered. That is not load imbalance, he said slowly, his voice drawing attention again without needing to raise it. That is interference. A few heads turned, sharper this time. The word carried weight, not because it implied danger, but because it implied intent. Lyra did not move, but her focus shifted immediately, aligning with his source, she said, and it was not directed at him. But he answered anyway, because the data had already resolved itself in his mind. External signal, low frequency, masked to look like background noise. He paused, tilting his head slightly as the pattern clarified. It is not trying to disrupt the system. It is trying to learn it. That landed harder than anything else had so far, not with noise, but with stillness, the kind that follows when a room realizes it has been observed without noticing. The engineer from before stepped closer to the display, running independent scans, verifying what Ethan had already stated, and again the system confirmed it. Clean, undeniable. Lyra's posture shifted by a fraction, not tension, not concern, but readiness, like someone who had just reached the part of the equation she had been waiting for. Can it be isolated? She asked, her tone precise. Ethan considered the question, not rushing, because rushing felt unnecessary when the answer was already there. Yes, he said, but not directly. He stepped closer to the central interface, the system recognizing the movement and adjusting without being asked, controls aligning to his reach, data reorganizing into a structure he did not remember learning but understood anyway. If we isolate it, it will adapt. He continued, fingers hovering just above the interface. It is designed to respond to pressure. He glanced at her briefly, then back at the display. But if we let it think it is still hidden, we can guide it. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in focus. Guide it where, she asked, and there was something in the question, not skepticism, but curiosity sharpened into expectation. Ethan allowed himself a small breath, because this part felt familiar in a way he could not explain. Into a closed loop, he said. Something that looks like the system, but is not connected to anything critical. The engineer hesitated, then nodded slowly. Understanding the concept, even if he had not seen it executed this way before, Lyra watched Ethan for a moment longer, measuring, confirming, and then she gave a single, decisive nod. Do it, she said, and just like that, the room shifted again, not in confusion this time, but in alignment, because the question of whether Ethan belonged there had already been answered, and now the only thing that mattered was what he would do next. Ethan rested his fingers against the interface, the system responding instantly, opening pathways, redirecting signals, constructing a space that did not exist until he needed it, and as the external interference followed the path he created, moving exactly where he expected it to go, he felt it again, that quiet, unsettling recognition, not of the system, but of himself within it, like he had done this before, like he was not solving a problem, but remembering how it had been solved. And somewhere beside him, Lyra's voice lowered just enough that only he could hear it. There you are, she said. And Ethan, watching the system respond to him like it always had, realized this was not the first time he had been found. The system did not resist the trap, it followed it, smoothly, almost willingly, as if it had been expecting a structure like this to exist. The false loop Ethan built folded around the external signal with quiet precision, layers sealing one by one until the interference was no longer part of the station, but not entirely removed either. Contained, studied, understood, the central display stabilized, fluctuations smoothing out into controlled patterns, and for the first time since it began, the room exhaled, not relief exactly, but acknowledgement that the unknown had been given boundaries. Ethan lifted his hand from the interface slowly, watching as the system continued running the containment exactly as he had configured it. No drift, no deviation, just clean execution. That should hold, he said, his voice calm, because anything else would have suggested this was unusual. Lyra stepped closer, her gaze scanning the containment model, verifying, confirming, and then, just as before, she accepted it without hesitation. It will, she said, and there was no doubt in it. Not about the system, not about him. Around them, the chamber began to move again. Quietly, carefully, advisors resuming their positions, officers exchanging low, controlled observations, but the focus did not leave Ethan. It shifted from question to recognition, from anomaly to asset, and that change was far more permanent than the problem he had just solved. The engineer who had challenged him earlier approached again, slower this time, more deliberate. That method is not in any of our operational protocols, he said, not accusing, but acknowledging the gap. Ethan gave a small shrug, the motion familiar, grounding. It probably should be, he replied, because explaining it felt unnecessary, and also because he was not entirely sure where the method had come from. The engineer nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was, or perhaps for what it was not, and stepped back. Lyra remained where she was, her attention no longer on the system, but on Ethan, and there was something different in it now, not just confirmation, but ownership, not possessive in a way that restricted, but in a way that defined, like she had drawn a line and placed him firmly within it. You adapted faster than projected, she said quietly, her voice low enough that the room did not claim it. Ethan glanced at her, one brow lifting slightly. I am going to assume there was a projection I was not invited to review, he said, dry as ever. She did not deny it, which was becoming a pattern he was starting to respect and distrust in equal measure. There were multiple, she replied. And then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, none of them accounted for this. Ethan looked back at the display, at the system that had responded to him like it knew him, at the containment loop that felt less like a solution and more like a memory, and he let out a quiet breath. That makes two of us, he said, because whatever this was, It was not something he had planned. The chamber lights adjusted subtly, returning to a more neutral tone now that the immediate disruption had been resolved. But the environment did not forget. Systems rarely did, and neither did people. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, layered with new information, new assumptions, new hierarchies that had not existed an hour ago. Lyra turned slightly, addressing the room without raising her voice. "He remains," she said, and that was it. No explanation, no justification, just a decision placed into the structure of the station like a permanent fixture. No one argued, not because they agreed, but because the outcome had already been demonstrated. Ethan Cole was no longer a variable to be evaluated. He was a constant the system had accepted. And as the room settled around that fact, Lyra's voice reached him one last time. Quiet, precise, carrying something that felt less like authority and more like inevitability. "You do not remember yet," she said. "But you will." Ethan did not answer, because for the first time since this began, he was not sure he wanted to. The system hummed softly around him, stable, obedient, familiar in a way that did not belong to his life until now. And somewhere beneath that familiarity was a question he could not ignore, not about what he had just done, but about what he had done before, because this was not the beginning. It was the continuation of something he had forgotten, and as the station adjusted to him like it always had, Ethan realized that whatever he had been trying to avoid by staying unnoticed, it had just found him anyway.